What exactly are the Iowa caucuses, and why is everyone making such a big deal about winning just one state in the Democratic primary election? Well, we're going to talk about it. Thanks for tuning in. So there are a lot of new registered voters here in 2020, which is a great thing. But because of that, there are also a lot of people who are just now tuning in to the Democratic primary and are hearing narratives from both the independent media and the mainstream media about what states are must wins going forward. And of course, being that Iowa is the first state in the Democratic primary, it makes sense that a lot of people are kind of inquisitive as to why this is called a caucus, one, and why New Hampshire, for example, is called a primary, and why there are so many people making such a huge deal about whether or not their candidate wins a primary and what that means going forward. So first, let's talk about the caucus itself. So a caucus is a little bit different than a primary, in case you don't know that. A caucus is, to be honest with you, it's somewhat archaic, but it is a little bit more personal, where people from communities and different neighborhoods actually have to go to a particular state or a particular precinct at a designated location and go stand, literally go stand in the designated area of the candidate they represent. If the person that they represent does not hit that 15% threshold at the caucus, then they are asked to then either go to another candidate or leave. Once again, a bit archaic, but it's interesting too because of the personability aspect of the Iowa caucuses. Now, the caucuses have been kind of a point of contention for quite some time, and a lot of states don't even use caucuses anymore because they are archaic. But Iowa's in a particularly unique situation because for some reason, New Hampshire actually has in their constitution that they are required to be the first state in the Democratic primary election. And technically, Iowa caucuses don't count as a primary state, which is super weird, I know, but that's what it is. Now, why are so many people worried about the outcome of the Iowa caucuses, right? I mean, there are only roughly 40 delegates, which is not that much for such a large state. And New Hampshire has like 33 delegates. There's not that big of a difference between the two states. And even Nevada doesn't really have that many, but people consider that a big state too. Well, here's why. It's because of the historical implications of what winning New Hampshire or Iowa specifically has meant for not only the Democratic primary election, but the general election as well. See, the Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primary, Nevada, all that stuff, the Democratic primary isn't a zero-sum game. And every single state matters because it gives you momentum. Depending on the demographics of the state, it tells you as a candidate how to strategize and plan for the upcoming states. And once again, in this particular case, right, it gives you momentum because you could end up on a debate stage that otherwise you might not have qualified for because of the, let's just call it, unique rules that the Democratic primary, or the DNC, which is the Democratic National Committee, has put on making the debates this time. So let's look at some of the victories and what that meant for them as far as winning their primary up to this point in the Democratic primary elections. So Hillary Clinton, quote unquote, won the Iowa caucus in 2016. Now, it should be, there's a caveat and an asterisk there because she won after 6 coin flips magically went her way. That's generally not how it works, but that's a different discussion for a different day. But she did go on to, quote unquote, win the Democratic primary. Barack Obama won, handedly so, by the way, the Iowa caucus in the Democratic primary 2008, and obviously, as we all know by now, Barack Obama won the Democratic primary election. John Kerry won the Iowa caucus in 2004. he goes on to win the Democratic primary election. And then Al Gore won the Iowa Caucus in 2000 and goes on to win the Democratic primary election. There is only one exception going all the way back to Bill Clinton, and that is in 1992, where the winner of the Democratic primary election did not win the Iowa caucus. That exception is Senator Harkin, who won Iowa in 1992, but he only won because he was the senator of Iowa at the time. He did not go on to win another state at all whatsoever. So the momentum there was kind of deflated and taken away from him because people were saying, well, of course you're going to win that state. You're literally the senator of that state. You've already proven that you could win an entire state the moment you became a senator. That's how it works generally. So when you're talking about the long-term implication for the Democratic primary, even with all of the encompassing momentum that may or may not take shape as you go forward, there is one thing for certain. Winning the Iowa caucus means that you have a legitimate chance to win the Democratic primary election. Yeah, so it's a big deal. Now, going forward, what does that mean for your prospects of winning the general election? That's pretty important, right? Because winning Iowa is all well and good, but you really don't know if you're going to win Iowa in the general election, right? You don't know if anybody's going to care if you win Iowa in the general election. So there are two things that we use to measure, that I'm using to measure how well, or looking at, I should say, to measure how well a candidate has a chance of winning the general based off of Iowa, and then that momentum going into New Hampshire, and then carrying that momentum to then go on, potentially win the primary, and then win the general election. So let's look at the 2016 election. Now, like I just said, Hillary Clinton won Iowa. Well, really, she tied it once again, and she tied it based off of six coin flips, but she like won it by like 0.0 something percent. But then Bernie beats her in New Hampshire. For the GOP, Trump won New Hampshire, but only lost by one delegate in Iowa to Ted Cruz, who actually became one of his most fervent backers in the general election. Now, even though Donald Trump only lost by one delegate in New Hampshire, or in Iowa. So he only lost by one delegate in Iowa. That's basically a tie as far as popularity is concerned. In other words, it wasn't like, because he and Cruz kind of smashed everybody else. And so it wasn't like he was dismantled and the Iowans decided altogether that they didn't like him. It was just that they thought that Cruz was slightly better according to the outcome. Now, as we all know, Hillary tied Iowa, but lost New Hampshire, handedly so, by the way. Then Trump basically ties Iowa, then goes on to win New Hampshire, and he wins the general election. So that's 2016. Let's go and look at the 2008 election. So for the Democrats, Obama won the Iowa caucuses and then actually literally tied Hillary in New Hampshire with 9 delegates apiece. For the GOP, Huckabee actually smashes everybody in the Iowa caucuses, which was kind of unexpected. But then John McCain goes on to win the New Hampshire primary. However, he lost by a significant margin in Iowa, which once again, it seemed like you can't lose by a significant margin in either state, because what happened next? Obama goes on to win the general election by a very wide margin. Like I said, he won Iowa and then literally tied in delegates in New Hampshire. Let's look at the 2000 elections. For the Democrats, Al Gore wins Iowa. Oh, Al Gore won Iowa and he won New Hampshire. But this is something that is unique because George W. Bush also won Iowa and New Hampshire. And both of them won pretty handedly. This is interesting because we know that both of them winning handedly in Iowa and New Hampshire actually ended up having a very, very close race that was decided by George W. Bush's brother, or excuse me, it was decided by a state that was ran by George W. Bush's brother, that where many people to this day still question the outcome of that Florida Supreme Court decision. So, but the ultimate moral of the story is it was that close because they won states that had very unique but also diverse political demographics, right? So in a situation where all things were equal, nobody was an incumbent, both of them won New Hampshire and won Iowa, and they both won those states definitively. We had an extremely close race that basically came down to the state that the one person had the upper hand in, which unfortunately that's just how politics goes sometimes. And that's why it went to Bush. If Bush would have lost in New Hampshire or lost in Iowa in the Democratic primary, it stands to be concluded that that George Bush would have actually lost to Al Gore. I can't really explain to you why that is, but like I said, for some reason, I don't know if it's that momentum carries into the general election, or is it that the unique voter demographics in the Midwest with Iowa, and then in an open primary state that is mostly independent, libertarian-esque leftists, maybe those demographics are pretty emblematic of the demographics in the major general election states. And because of that, and obviously it's kind of a momentum, well, not really. No, the general election isn't a momentum game in the sense of, you got one state, then another state. No, it's all on the same night. So you don't get to sway and rock based off of what you see from a day-to-day primary race. Instead, it's like, no, this is basically where I'm at, and I'm probably not going to change, and I'm basing where I'm at based off of my political ideology that seems to be most represented in Iowa and New Hampshire. Like, most people are voting based off of what the people are voting for in Iowa and New Hampshire, a combination of the two. Super weird, I know, super weird, but hey, Trump once again, so we gotta look back at history. Trump he statistically ties Ted Cruz in Iowa, wins New Hampshire handedly, wins the general. McCain loses Iowa, gets obliterated in Iowa by Mike Huckabee, wins New Hampshire, but loses in the general. So my thing is, in Iowa, if you're Trump, if you're McCain, most of those Midwestern states are supposed to go to you in the general election. But if you can't win and galvanize people in Iowa as a Republican, how many people are you going to get to come out and vote for you and campaign for you against, once again, at the time, one of the, if not the most popular president now in history? You got to win those. You got to win Iowa. You got to get the Midwest to galvanize behind you. And it killed him in the general because those demographics are very emblematic of all the other demographics in that region. Then once again, you got the George Bush, Al Gore, where they both won their primaries for Iowa and New Hampshire, but then go on to have a really, really, really close race because those voter demographics both liked Bush and Gore. And so once again, that was basically determined by a state in Florida that was ran by George Bush's brother. So that is why, ladies and gentlemen, the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primary are taken so seriously because, well, we might just find the winner of our Democratic primary and subsequently the general election based off of what happens in the next 2 weeks. It's kind of scary, I know, but believe it or not, politics isn't all that complicated. So when I say now is the time to pay attention. Now is the time to fight. Now is the time to call out any type of suspect behavior, any type of attempts to rig openly or, behind closed doors, any type of suspicious activity. This is the time you report it. Don't wait until later. When you're seeing other people kind of say the same thing, say it now. And if you're seeing people trying to tell you that Iowa doesn't mean what it means, or that New Hampshire doesn't mean what it means, they're wrong. I'm just being real with you. And if, for example, Bernie Sanders wins Iowa, but then somehow, and then Mike Bloomberg, I don't even think he's going to be competitive in New Hampshire either. Joe Biden, I don't think is going to be competitive in New Hampshire either. So if Bernie Sanders wins Iowa, and then he goes on to place first or second in New Hampshire, just know that the odds of that happening, and then somehow, some way, Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg ends up being the Democratic primary nominee, understand something. That would be against the last, oh my gosh, it's 2020 right now. Basically, the last time that happened would be 1992. And once again, I already explained to you all, the only reason that someone else won the primary and Bill Clinton did not is because that the senator was literally from that state. You get what I'm saying? So like, even that, we can't really use it as a solid example, because then Bill Clinton went on to win New Hampshire handedly. So almost 30 years. And once again, they didn't have anywhere near the crowd turnouts, and except for Obama. Obama did have some of the crowd turnout, but then Bernie broke his records there, then broke his records in fundraising as well from individual donors. So when you combine all these things, what we see in Iowa and what we will be seeing in New Hampshire could very well determine the outcome of not only the primary election, but the general election as well. So with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all so much for tuning into that segment. Wasn't live stream this time. YouTube's been giving me a lot of trouble there. But thank you for tuning into that segment of Mikasa Sukasa. And always remember, more than anything else, ladies and gentlemen, find your balance. Peace.